Hello and wonderful to have you here. Today we're going to be discussing something of a controversy. The controversy over the ordination of nuns in certain contemporary Buddhist schools. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses about the Dharma of early Buddhism. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. On today's video, what I'm going to be discussing is known as the controversy over the ordination of nuns, or Bhikkhuni, or as they're called in Pali. I'll be discussing mostly the issue in the Theravāda lineage, which is the lineage, the school of Buddhism that we find in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, a number of different countries down there, as well as the origin of schools in the West, such as Insight Buddhism, or Vipassana is known as. And there's also a similar problem in the Tibetan lineage of Buddhism, and I'll only be dealing with that in passing here because it's just too big of a topic for me to discuss all of it, but a similar kind of thing is going on there. Now in this video, I'll plan to have it in 3 parts. So the first part will be discussing a little bit of the history, in particular the recent history. Then we'll get into the reason why there's a controversy, what essentially are the legal issues, the issues around Buddhist law that make this a controversy. And then third, we'll turn to some of the upshots, what we can take from it, what's going on right now, what kinds of lessons we can take from this into the way that we understand Buddhism today. Now, to begin with a bit of the history. The early history, I'm not going to go into in any detail right here. I did an earlier video on women in Buddhism where I discussed some of that history in a little bit more detail. I'll put a link to that video down below if you want to know more. But basically, the upshot is that the Buddha instituted a monastic order obviously for men, but also for women during his lifetime. And that monastic order of women, what are known as bhikkhunis, the nuns, persisted in the Theravāda lineage for many hundreds of years. However, it did die out in the 11th century. And ever since then, until relatively recently, we'll get to this, there weren't any female monastics in the Theravāda lineage, literal monastics. There were women who may have taken more vows than other women and so on, but they were not considered literal monastics. In 1988, however, in California, 20 women, with the help of some people from different countries, from Tibet, from Sri Lanka, and from China, from Taiwan, in fact, bhikkhunis from Taiwan, decided to, or were able to, become bhikkhunis. They were ordained as bhikkhunis, or this is the question, were they? That was their intention. And then after that, there were a number of different ordinations that took place. In 1996 and 1998, a number of different women were ordained into the Sri Lankan lineage of Theravāda Buddhism, with a couple of different ordination ceremonies that took place in India. And in 2001, a woman was ordained as the first female monastic in Thailand, a woman who became known as a nun named Dhammananda. She was perhaps arguably the first female monastic ever in Thailand. And then in July of 2007, there was an international conference on the role of women in the Sangha, in the Buddhist Sangha. And it took place under the aegis of the Dalai Lama. And in this conference, the Dalai Lama said, people were looking to him for guidance and leadership on this issue. And he said that while he believed in his heart that the Buddha would have allowed women to become reordained or to reordain, he himself believed that he did not have the power to force this forward. He couldn't force people to ordain women as bhikkhunis or bhikshunis in the Tibetan lineage. And this stance by the Dalai Lama was a great blow to many people who were in the audience, and indeed many people around the world, because they had hoped that he would have had the power, the institutional authority to push this forward in a way that he did not believe he did. Then in 2009, perhaps one of the most important things is that Ajahn Brahm, who is a Western monastic but lives in Australia, he's from a Thai lineage, the lineage of the Thai forest monastics of Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Brahm decided on his own to ordain several women into his lineage and went through with the ceremony with great fanfare. After the ceremony was completed, he was asked to go back to Thailand to stand in front of his monastery, the monastery of Ajahn Chah that he had been ordained in. And the monastery, when he arrived, told him that he would have to recant these ordinations. When he refused, when Ajahn Brahm refused to recant the ordinations, the Thai monastery cut ties. They basically decided they were not going to have anything to do with his monastery anymore. Basically, they were rejecting him as a monastic, rejecting his monastery as being in communion with them. So as we can see, this is still an item of some controversy, still a subject of controversy. But what is the controversy? And so that's what I want to get into right now. It's a controversy over what's known as the Vinaya. The Vinaya are the books, the texts that record the Buddhist law, the laws over the Sangha, over issues such as ordination, over the rules that monks and nuns have to follow if they become ordained. And this is a huge issue. People have written, I'm sure, hundreds, maybe even thousands of pages on this, so I'm only going to be able to touch the basic issues here in this talk. But in any event, the basic idea here is that for a bhikkhuni, a woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni, it takes several years, according to the Vinaya. And it's supposed to be a process that is overseen, and then the ordination is done by both men and women. That is to say, both by bhikkhus or monks, male monastics, and by bhikshunis or bhikkhunis, that is to say, female monastics. But the problem is, in the Theravāda lineage, the lineage of female monastics died out, so there aren't any female monastics who are capable of performing the ceremony of ordaining somebody as a female monastic. It's basically a kind of catch-22. So basically there are two options. Either you perform the ceremony using female monastics from a different lineage, that are not from the Theravāda lineage, because there aren't any, but you go to a different, let's say, Mahayana lineage, find female monastics in that lineage, bring them and have them do the ceremony for you. Or you find a way to do the ceremony with only monks, with only using monks, because there are only monks, at least there were only monks capable of doing the ceremony. In the Theravāda lineage, there weren't any women. Now, either one of these looks like a possibility. However, there are various people within the Theravāda school who have been termed legalists, shall we say conservative legalists, who claim that both of these options are closed. Neither of them is a real option. Perhaps the two most famous legalists in the West are Ajahn Sumedho, who was an American monk who had a monastery in England, and Bhikkhu Thanissaro, who is probably the most famous person who was against this. In other words, he has been the most outspoken over the years that it is impossible to reform a lineage of female monastics within the Theravāda school. His claim basically is that for a woman to become a bhikkhuni, she requires several years of training by other bhikkhunis. This can't be done by people outside of the Theravāda lineage because they're not familiar with the way that the Theravāda school interprets the Dharma. And also, it can't be done by men because men are not allowed by the Vinaya to live with women. I mean, that's part of what it is to be a monk. But you need somebody who is living with these women, certainly in their first few years, according to him, to be able to truly instruct people in the Dharma, to know whether they're doing things right or wrong. As he says, when there is no longer a community of living, well-trained mentors who can oversee the apprenticeship of new monastics, the living tradition is dead and cannot be revived simply by consulting texts. What we have now instead is a situation in which new bhikkhunis are faced with the prospect of learning only from books, from untrained senior bhikkhunis, or from bhikshunis. Bhikshuni is the Sanskrit word for bhikkhuni, and this indicates that he's talking about people ordained in the Mahayana tradition, or from bhikshunis trained in non-Theravādan traditions that treat teachings such as those found in the Prajnaparamita Sutra as authoritative. At the same time, the senior bhikkhunis, living in an age where counterfeit Dhamma is widely available and the true Dhamma has thus disappeared, are free to choose their Dhamma according to their preferences, with no genuinely trained bhikkhunis to hold them in check. For Bhikkhu Thanissaro to say that the Dharma has disappeared is essentially to say that there is a real question among certain people about what the Dharma is. And in particular, there's a question as to whether we are going to accept, let's say, the Theravāda Dharma, the Theravāda way of interpreting the texts, or what he calls the Prajnaparamita, people who accept the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Now, that is a way of him saying Mahayana, because the Prajnaparamita Sutras are basically foundational sutras. They're late sutras written around the turn of the Common Era, which are foundational really to the Mahayana way of viewing the Dharma. And indeed, Bhikkhu Thanissaro says that this kind of Dharma is, he says, directly opposed to the Buddha's teaching. So essentially then, any woman who is ordained under the aegis or with the help of nuns from the Mahayana school are not, at least in Thanissaro's eyes, are not nuns in the Theravāda tradition. They've then been ordained into the Mahayana, into this tradition of the Prajnaparamita. And so they aren't acceptable to him. And this is the case even if these nuns, these bhikkhunis, are not otherwise Mahayana. Even if they don't accept Mahayana interpretation, perhaps they're not interested in the Prajnaparamita, perhaps they're only interested in a Theravāda way of looking at things, of looking at the Dharma. And nevertheless, for Thanissaro, they nevertheless are not Theravāda monastics. Now, on the other side of this issue, we have a group of monastics who we might term the progressives. Now, famous monastic progressives include Bhante Gunaratana, include Ajahn Brahm, who we've already mentioned, includes Bhikkhu Analayo, who's written an enormous amount over this issue, Bhikkhu Sujato, Bhikkhu Brahmali, and Bhikkhu Bodhi. And for an idea of the thinking behind some of these progressives, I'll cite a passage that Bhikkhu Bodhi has written about this issue. He says, "In my opinion, in deciding between the conservative and the progressive approaches to the bhikkhuni issue, the question that should be foremost in our minds is this: what would the Buddha want his elder bhikkhu disciples to do in such a situation, now in the 21st century? If he were to see us pondering this problem today, would he want us to apply the regulations governing ordination in a way that excludes women from the fully ordained renunciant life, so that we present to the world a religion in which men alone can lead the life of full renunciation? Or would he instead want us to apply the regulations of the Vinaya in a way that is kind, generous, and accommodating, thereby offering the world a religion that truly embodies principles of justice and non-discrimination?" And Bhikkhu Bodhi and others point to traditional monastics from East Asian countries that have already said this, that ordaining women is a possibility nowadays. They look to people such as Venerable Dhammavihari from Sri Lanka and the Jethavan Sayadaw from Burma as examples of this. And indeed, Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated one of these, a work by the Jethavan Sayadaw arguing this very thing. So these progressives then argue, using the Vinaya, that actually both of our previous possibilities are actually open to us. That indeed it is possible to ordain women using bhikkhunis from other lineages, from Mahayana lineages, and that it's also possible actually to ordain bhikkhunis using only monks. Bhikkhu Bodhi has argued that the lineage of the Mahayana that they're talking about, it's called the Dharma-guptaka lineage. The Dharma-guptaka lineage, he says, never formally separated from the Theravāda. This would have been many, many centuries, even millennia ago, but that they never formally separated. It's simply that they ended up being in different parts of India and so eventually lost touch with each other. But that essentially their following of the Vinaya, their rules and regulations are close enough that it really doesn't matter. And so therefore, there's no reason to exclude a nun who is ordained by somebody in the Dharma-guptaka lineage, because there's been no formal separation here. We should also keep in mind that this separation of lineages between the Dharma-guptaka and the Theravāda is not, or never has been, in Buddhism, it's not a matter of doctrine. It's not a matter of Dharma. In the West, we generally think of people splitting off, for instance, let's say Catholics and Protestants, splitting off as a matter of belief. Whereas in Buddhism, these separations occur because of matters of Vinaya, that is the practice of becoming a monastic or being a monastic. The separation is not because of the Dharma itself. And so therefore, the difference between these schools is not a difference of Dharma. It's simply a difference of slightly different practices within their rules, their Vinaya rules, but these practices are not different enough or shouldn't matter enough, and so we should accept these kinds of ordinations. Now, the second possibility here is what's known as single ordination, that is to say, being ordained only by male monastics, since there aren't any female monastics. And this is an option that, in particular, Bhikkhu Analayo has been arguing strenuously is possible given the historical background. And he looks to, in fact, the early history of the Sangha when the Buddha was still alive. And he notes that when the first woman became ordained as a nun, Mahapajapati Gotami, the Buddha's stepmother, the Buddha, at least so it's said, this is what comes down to us, that a lot of this history is very garbled, but in any event, the information we have is that when she was asked to ordain, or when she asked to ordain, the Buddha said you have to accept these particular, I believe, 8 rules that all women will have to accept. And one of these rules was that, as we've said, that women have to be ordained by monks and nuns at the same, or not at the same time, but their ordination ceremony has to include monks and nuns. And she agreed to this rule, and so therefore became the first nun. However, she also had 500 followers, it's said, and they also wanted to become nuns, bhikkhunis. But there was nobody at that time who could ordain them, because in order to do the ordination, you have to have spent a number of years as a nun. And so Mahapajapati Gotami went to the Buddha and said, well, so what are we going to do about these 500 women who also want to be ordained? And the Buddha said, if they want to be ordained, let a monk do it. And importantly, he did not himself do it. It wasn't like he said, oh, well, this is such an important thing that only I, a Buddha, can do this. Instead, he sort of looked to one of his other monks and said, well, why don't some of my monks ordain them? And that's an end to it. So the argument goes from Analayo that if this was possible back when the Buddha was alive, that monks alone could ordain these 500 women, then why can't we simply use that same precedent and have monks alone do it now? Because obviously there's nobody else who can, or at least on one theory, there's nobody else who can, so let's just look to the Buddha's own precedent. Now, the legalists argue that that was superseded by the order of dual ordination, and since it was superseded by that rule, we can't go back to it. That's the argument for what it's worth. Now I want to turn to our third issue, which is where are we now and where do we go from here? Bhikkhu Bodhi has argued in one of his papers that basically the issue has been settled. There now are bhikkhunis once again in the Theravāda lineage. Indeed, there are now, by some counts, over 2,000 bhikkhunis in Sri Lanka. And there are women, ordained women in the West, in various centers in the United States and elsewhere, in Thailand as well, as we mentioned, in a number of countries. However, there is continuing pushback from, we might term, conservative legalists about this issue. And indeed, we may look at this as, once again, the problem of male gatekeepers sort of deciding who gets let in the door and who doesn't, who gets let into the club and who doesn't. But in all of this, I think the base issue has to do with the role of the laity. That is, the broader lay community, which supports the Sangha at the end of the day. And to that end, there's a very interesting ethnographic study out recently by Suzanne Mrozek. I believe that's how to pronounce her name. I don't know exactly, but I believe it's pronounced Mrozek. If I'm mispronouncing it, sorry. She's done study among people in a small village in Sri Lanka that have a Bhikkhuni Sangha set up there. And her study has been to investigate how this Bhikkhuni Sangha is taking root. In other words, what is the relation between these new bhikkhunis and the lay people who support them? And indeed, the lay support is particularly important for bhikkhunis because in Sri Lanka, since this whole thing is still a matter of some debate and controversy, bhikkhunis do not get any support from the state. They only get support from the local communities, unlike male monastics. So what is the general upshot? Well, one of the things that Mrozek finds is that local people just really don't know much about the legal issues and don't particularly care about them to any great extent. What they care about is how the nuns comport themselves. How do they behave? How do they do their supposed duties? In other words, do they play the role of nuns in a beneficial way to the community? Do they behave properly? And through that, are they able to gain the support and love of the community? And what she finds is that indeed that is the case. That in fact, the bhikkhunis are doing a better job of this than the bhikkhus, than the male monastics in the same kinds of communities. She finds that the lay people express their love, and she uses this word expressly many times, love for the bhikkhunis, that they express love for them in familial terms, that they are both like their children as being somewhat vulnerable and as being like their parents and sort of showing them the way forward. And so there has been, she says, a great deal of affection built up because these bhikkhunis are in a certain way closer to the lay society than the bhikkhus are. The bhikkhus are perhaps on a somewhat higher platform socioculturally, whereas the bhikkhunis are closer to the men and particularly the women of the communities, and so through that have built a base of support. And going forward, this role that the lay community is going to play is going to be central in deciding whether these bhikkhuni lineages become viewed as legitimate or not. It has always been the case in the Vinaya that the Buddha has paid attention to the lay community. Indeed, many of the rulings in the Buddhist legal code are rulings made because the Buddha felt that doing otherwise would harm the lay community, that the lay community would not like it if the monks did X, Y, or Z, and so therefore the monks shouldn't do X, Y, or Z. And so we see a kind of a situation here. Indeed, there's a famous example in the early texts of a kind of what we might consider similar kind of occurrence that we see nowadays with this controversy. And this involves an ongoing argument between the monks of Kosambi. And it's said that the monks of Kosambi fell into a long argument with one another, that there were endless debates and disagreements and shouting matches. And that even, it said, the Buddha himself went to Kosambi and tried to intervene and intercede and tried to bring them together, but they pushed him away. They said, this is not your concern. We have to hash this out ourselves. So the Buddha was not even able to settle the matter himself. So what did settle the matter? Well, what settled the matter eventually was the lay community of Kosambi. The lay community began to withhold their veneration, withhold their respect from the monastics. And perhaps equally important, if not more important, they began to withhold their donations of food, which of course are necessary to keep the monastic sangha alive. And through this withholding of support, the lay sangha was able to bring the monks of Kosambi back together again, and so in a way that they could overcome their differences. And in a similar way, nowadays, I know of at least one prominent lay Theravāda sangha that has broken ties with Bhikkhu Thanissaro over this issue. And I know also that Ajahn Sumedho retired in 2010, pretty much right after the 2009 ordinations of these women by Ajahn Brahm, who was in the same community from the same Thai sangha. So I think these are both indications that something is going on in these particular sanghas that is more than just an issue of legalisms, but becomes an issue of the broader interaction between the lay community and the monastic community. And I did an earlier video on on the role of such kinds of debates and disputes in Buddhism, what the Buddha had to say when simply arguing and discussing isn't enough. And I'll put a link to that video up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please take a look at my Patreon page. It's linked down below, where you can find things that you will like and can support us. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.